And if any mischief follow, then thou shalt give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Exodus 21:12 and 23-25. He that killeth any man shall surely be put to death. And if a man cause a blemish in his neighbors, as he hath done, so shall it be done unto him. Breach for breach, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Leviticus 24:17, 19, 20. Then the judges shall make diligent inquisition. And behold, if the witness be a false witness, and hath testified falsely against his brother, then shall ye do unto him as he had thought to have done unto his brother. And thine eye shall not pity, but life shall go on for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Deuteronomy 29:18-21. Noah, Moses, and the prophets taught that he who kills, maims, or injures his neighbor does evil. To resist such evil, and to prevent it, the evildoer must be punished with death, or maiming, or some physical injury. Wrong must be opposed by wrong, murder by murder, injury by injury, evil by evil. Thus taught Noah, Moses, and the prophets. But Christ rejects all this. I say unto you, is written in the gospel, resist not evil. Do not oppose injury with injury, but rather bear repeated injury from the evildoer. What was permitted is forbidden. When we understand what kind of resistance they taught, we know exactly what resistance Christ forbade. Q. Then the ancients allowed the resistance of injury by injury? A. Yes, but Jesus forbids it. The Christian has in no case the right to put to death his neighbor who has done him evil, or to do him injury in return. Q. May he kill or maim in self-defense? A. No. Q. May he go with a complaint to the judge that he who has wronged him may be punished? A. No. What he does through others, he is in reality doing himself. Q. Can he fight in conflict with foreign enemies or disturbers of the peace? A. Certainly not. He cannot take part in war or in preparations for war. He cannot make use of a deadly weapon. He cannot oppose injury to injury, whether he is alone or with others, either in person or through other people. Q. Can he voluntarily vote or furnish soldiers for the government? A. He can do nothing of that kind if he wishes to be faithful to Christ's law. Q. Can he voluntarily give money to aid a government resting on military force, capital punishment, and violence in general? A. No, unless the money is destined for some special object right in itself, and good both in aim and means. Q. Can he pay taxes to such a government? A. No. He ought not voluntarily to pay taxes, but he ought not to resist the collecting of taxes. A tax is levied by the government, and is exacted independently of the will of the subject. It is impossible to resist it without having recourse to violence of some kind. Since the Christian cannot employ violence, he is obliged to offer his property at once to the loss by violence inflicted on it by the authorities. Q. Can a Christian give a vote at elections, or take part in a government or law business? A. No. Participation in election, government, or law business is participation in government by force. Q. Wherein lies the chief significance of the doctrine of nonresistance? A. In the fact that it alone allows of the possibility of eradicating evil from one's own heart, and also from one's neighbor's. This doctrine forbids doing that whereby evil has endured for ages and multiplied in the world. He who attacks another and injures him kindles in the other a feeling of hatred, the root of every evil. To injure another because he has injured us, even with the aim of overcoming evil, is doubling the harm for him and for oneself. It is begetting, or at least setting free and enticing, that evil spirit which we should wish to drive out. Satan can never be driven out by Satan. Error can never be corrected by error. And evil cannot be vanquished by evil. True non-resistance is the only real resistance to evil. It is crushing the serpent's head. It destroys, and in the end, extirpates the evil feeling. Q. But if that is the true meaning of the rule of non-resistance, can it always put into practice? A. It can be put into practice like every virtue enjoined by the law of God. A virtue cannot be practiced in all circumstances without self-sacrifice, privation, suffering, and in extreme cases, loss of life itself. But he who esteems life more than fulfilling the will of God is already dead to the only true life. Trying to save his life, he loses it. Besides, generally speaking, where non-resistance costs the sacrifice of a single life, or of some material welfare, resistance costs 1,000 such sacrifices. Non-resistance is salvation. Resistance is ruin. It is incomparably less dangerous to act justly than unjustly, to submit to injuries than to resist them with violence, less dangerous even in one's relations to the present life. If all men refused to resist evil by evil, our world would be happy. Q. But so long as only a few act thus, what will happen to them? A. If only one man acted thus, and all the rest agreed to crucify him, would it not be nobler for him to die in the glory of non-resisting love, praying for his enemies, than to live to wear the crown of Caesar, stained with the blood of the slain? However, one man, or 1,000 men, firmly resolved not to oppose evil by evil, are far more free from danger by violence than those who resort to violence, whether among civilized or savage neighbors. The robber, the murderer, and the cheat will leave them in peace sooner than those who oppose them with arms, and those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword, but those who seek after peace and behave kindly and harmlessly, forgiving and forgetting injuries, for the most part enjoy peace, or, if they die blessed. In this way, if we all kept the ordinance of non-resistance, there would obviously be no evil nor crime. If the majority acted thus, they would establish the rule of love and goodwill even over evildoers, never opposing evil with evil and never resorting to force. If there were a moderately large minority of such men, they would exercise such a salutary moral influence on society that every cruel punishment would be abolished, and violence and feud would be replaced by peace and love. Even if there were only a small minority of them, they would rarely experience anything worse than the world's contempt. And meantime, the world, though unconscious of it, and not grateful for it, would be continually becoming wiser and better for their unseen action on it. And if, in the worst case, some members of the minority were persecuted to death, in dying for the truth, they would have left behind them their doctrine, sanctified by the blood of their martyrdom. Peace, then, to all who seek peace, and may overruling love be the imperishable heritage of every soul who obeys willingly Christ's word, resist not evil. Aidan Ballou. For 50 years, Ballou wrote and published books dealing principally with the question of non-resistance to evil by force. In these works, which are distinguished by the clearness of their thought and eloquence of exposition, the question is looked at from every possible side, and the binding nature of this command on every Christian who acknowledges the Bible as the revelation of God is firmly established. All the ordinary objections to the doctrine of non-resistance from the Old and New Testaments are brought forward, such as the expulsion of the money changers from the temple, and so on, and arguments follow in disproof of them all. The practical reasonableness of this rule of conduct is shown independently of Scripture, and all the objections ordinarily made against its practicability are stated and refuted. Thus, one chapter in a book of his treats of non-resistance in exceptional cases, and he owns in this connection that if there were cases in which the rule of non-resistance were impossible of application, it would prove that the law was not universally authoritative. Quoting these cases, he shows that it is precisely in them that the application of the rule is both necessary and reasonable. There is no aspect of the question, either on his side or on his opponent's, which he has not followed up in his writings. I mention all this to show the unmistakable interest which such works ought to have for men who make a profession of Christianity, and because one would have thought Ballou's work would have been well known, and the ideas expressed by him would have been either accepted or refuted. But such has not been the case. The work of Garrison the Father, in his foundation of the Society of Non-Resistance and his declaration, even more than my correspondence with the Quakers, convinced me of the fact that the departure of the ruling form of Christianity from the law of Christ on non-resistance by force is an error that has long been observed and pointed out, and that men have labored and are still laboring to correct. Ballou's work confirmed me still more in this view. But the fate of Garrison, still more than that of Ballou, in being completely unrecognized, in spite of 50 years of obstinate and persistent work in the same direction, confirmed me in the idea that there exists a kind of tacit but steadfast conspiracy of silence about all such efforts. Ballou died in August 1890, and there was an obituary notice of him in an American Journal of Christian Views, Religio-Philosophical Journal, August 23. In this laudatory notice it is recorded that Ballou was the spiritual director of a parish, that he delivered from 8,000 to 9,000 sermons, married 1,000 couples, and wrote about 500 articles. But there is not a single word said of the object to which he devoted his life. Even the word non-resistance is not mentioned. Precisely as it was with all the preaching of the Quakers for 200 years and, too, with the efforts of Garrison the Father, the foundation of his society and journal, and his declaration, so it is with the life work of Ballou. It seems just as though it did not exist and never had existed. We have an astounding example of the obscurity of works which aim at expounding the doctrine of non-resistance to evil by force, and at confuting those who do not recognize this commandment. In the book of the Czech Helchetsky, which has only lately been noticed and has not hitherto been printed. Soon after the appearance of my book in German, I received a letter from Prague from a professor of the university there, informing me of the existence of a work never yet printed by Helchetsky, a Czech of the 5th century, entitled The Net of Faith. In this work, the professor told me, Helchetsky expressed precisely the same view as to true and false Christianity as I had expressed in my book What I Believe. The professor wrote to me that Helchetsky's work was to be published for the first time in the Czech language in the Journal of the Petersburg Academy of Science. Since I could not obtain the book itself, I tried to make myself acquainted with what was known of Helchetsky, and I gained the following information from a German book sent me by the Prague professor from Pippin's History of Czech Literature. This was Pippin's account. The net of faith is Christ's teaching, which ought to draw man up out of the dark depths of the sea of worldliness and his own iniquity. True faith consists in believing God's word, but now a time has come when men mistake the true faith for heresy, and therefore it is for the reason to point out what the true faith consists in, if anyone does not know this. It is hidden in darkness from men, and they do not recognize the true law of Christ. To make this law plain, Helchetsky points to the primitive organization of Christian society, the organization which, he says, is now regarded in the Roman Church as an abominable heresy. This primitive church was his special ideal of societal organization, founded on equality, liberty, and fraternity. Christianity, in Helchitsky's view, still preserves these elements, and it is only necessary for society to return to its pure doctrine to render unnecessary every other form of social order in which kings and popes are essential. The law of love would alone be sufficient in every case. Historically, Helchitsky attributes the degeneration of Christianity to the times of Constantine the Great, whom the Pope Sylvester admitted into the Christian Church with all his heathen morals and life. Constantine, in his turn, endowed the Pope with worldly riches and power. From that time forward, these two ruling powers were constantly aiding one another to strive for nothing but outward glory. Divines and ecclesiastical dignitaries began to concern themselves only about subduing the whole world to their authority, inciting men against one another to murder and plunder, and in creed and life reduced Christianity to a nullity. Helchitsky denies completely the right to make war and to inflict the punishment of death. Every soldier, even the knight, is only a violent evildoer, a murderer. The same account is given by the German book, with the addition of a few biographical details and some extracts from Helchitsky's writings. Having learnt the drift from Helchitsky's teaching in this way, I awaited all the more impatiently the appearance of The Net of Faith in the Journal of the Academy. But 1 year passed, then 2 and 3, and still the book did not appear. It was only in 1888 that I learned that the printing of the book, which had been begun, was stopped. I obtained the proofs of what had been printed and read them through. It is a marvelous book from every point of view. Its general tenor is given with perfect accuracy by Pippin. Helchitsky's fundamental idea is that Christianity, by allying itself with temporal power in the days of Constantine, and by continuing to develop in such conditions, has become completely distorted and has ceased to be Christian altogether. Helchitsky gave the title, The Net of Faith, to his book, taking as his motto the verse of the Gospel about the calling of the disciples to be fishers of men, and developing this metaphor, he says, Christ, by means of his disciples, would have caught all the world in his net of faith, but the greater fishes broke the net and escaped out of it, and all the rest have slipped through the holes made by the greater fishes, so that the net has remained quite empty. The greater fishes who broke the net are the rulers, emperors, popes, kings, who have not renounced power, and instead of true Christianity have put on what is simply a mask of it. Helchitsky teaches precisely what has been, and is taught in these days by the non-resistant Mennonites and Quakers, and in former tunes by the Bogomilites, Paulicians, and many others. He teaches that Christianity, expecting from its adherents gentleness, meekness, peaceableness, forgiveness of injuries, turning the other cheek when one is struck, and love for enemies, is inconsistent with the use of force, which is an indispensable condition of authority. The Christian, according to Helchitsky's reasoning, not only cannot be a ruler or a soldier, he cannot take any part in government, nor in trade, or even be a landowner. He can only be an artisan or a husbandman. This book is one of the few works attacking official Christianity that has escaped being burned. All such so-called heretical works were burned at the stake, together with their authors, so that there are few ancient works exposing the errors of official Christianity. The book has a special interest for this reason alone. But apart from its interest from every point of view, it is one of the most remarkable products of thought for its depth of aim, for the astounding strength and beauty of the national language in which it is written, and for its antiquity. And yet for more than 4 centuries it has remained unprinted, and is still unknown except to a few learned specialists. One would have thought that all such works, whether of the Quakers, of Garrison, of Ballou, or of Helchitsky, asserting and proving as they do, on the principles of the gospel, that our modern world takes a false view of Christ's teaching, would have awakened interest, excitement, talk, and discussion among spiritual leaders and their flocks alike. Works of this kind, dealing with the very essence of Christian doctrine, ought, one would have thought, to have been examined and accepted as true, or refuted and rejected, but nothing of the kind has occurred, and the same fate has been repeated with all those works. Men of the most diverse views, believers, and, what is surprising, unbelieving liberals also, as though by agreement, all preserve the same persistent silence about them, and all that has been done by people to explain the true meaning of Christ's doctrine remains either ignored or forgotten. But it is still more astonishing that 2 other books, of which I heard on the appearance of my book, should be so little known. I mean Diamond's book on War, published for the first time in London in 1824, and Daniel Musser's book on nonresistance, written in 1864. It is peculiarly astonishing that these books should be unknown, because, apart from their intrinsic merits, both books treat not so much of the theory of the practical application, of the theory to life, of the attitude of Christianity to military service, which is especially important and interesting now in these days of universal conscription. People will ask, perhaps, how ought a subject to behave who believes that war is inconsistent with his religion, while the government demands from him that he should enter military service? This question is, I think, a most vital one, and the answer to it is especially important in these days of universal conscription. All, or at least the great majority of the people, are Christians, and all men are called upon for military service. How ought a man, as a Christian, to meet this demand? This is the gist of Diamond's answer. His duty is humbly but steadfastly to refuse to serve. There are some people who, without any definite reasoning about it, conclude straightway that the responsibility of government measures rests entirely on those who resolve on them, or that the governments and sovereigns decide the question of what is good or bad for their subjects, and the duty of the subjects is merely to obey. I think that arguments of this kind only obscure men's conscience. I cannot take part in the councils of government, and therefore I am not responsible for its misdeeds. Indeed, but we are responsible for our own misdeeds, and the misdeeds of our rulers become our own if we, knowing that they are misdeeds, assist in carrying them out. Those who suppose that they are bound to obey the government, and that the responsibility for the misdeeds they commit is transferred from them to their rulers, deceive themselves. They say, "We give our acts up to the will of others, and our acts cannot be good or bad. There is no merit in what is good, nor responsibility for what is evil in our actions, since they are not done of our own will." It is remarkable that the very same thing is said in the instructions to soldiers which they make them learn. That is, that the officer is alone responsible for the consequences of his command. But this is not right. A man cannot get rid of the responsibility for his own actions, and that is clear from the following example. If your officer commands you to kill your neighbor's child, to kill your father or your mother, would you obey? If you would not obey, the whole argument falls to the ground, for if you can disobey the governors in one case, where do you draw the line up to which you can obey them? There is no line other than that laid down by Christianity, and that line is both reasonable and practicable. And therefore we consider the duty of every man who thinks war inconsistent with Christianity, meekly but firmly to refuse to serve in the army. And let those whose lot it is to act thus, remember that the fulfillment of a great duty rests with them. The destiny of humanity in the world depends, so far as it depends on men at all, on their fidelity to their religion. Let them confess their conviction and stand up for it, and not in words alone, but in sufferings too, if need be. If you believe that Christ forbade murder, pay no heed to the arguments nor to the commands of those who call on you to bear a hand in it. By such a step